For 3 years, Emeric Solon had ordered men to disappear using a voice that never once rose above a murmur. Then, at 2 in the morning, through the dying static of a low-signal radio station, he heard hers, and for the first time since he was a boy, the noise inside his skull went silent. He never asked her name. He didn't need it. He needed only the 11 minutes she spoke into the dark each night. So when her broadcasts stopped without warning, Emeric broke every rule that had kept him alive to find the woman behind the sound. What waited on the other side of that door didn't just end the marriage his family had arranged for him. It unmade the man he'd spent a lifetime becoming, and he let it. Winter had come early to the city, and Emeric Solon preferred it that way. The cold thinned the streets. It sent the desperate indoors and the ambitious to warmer places, and it left the harbor district scoured, clean, and echoing, which suited a man who did his most important work in silence. His penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of the Ardennes, a tower of black glass that looked down on the frozen river like something built to keep watch. Inside, everything was engineered to disappear. The floors were pale stone, polished until they gave back no reflection. The walls held no photographs, no paintings, nothing that might tell a visitor who lived there or whether anyone lived there at all. The air moved through hidden vents at a temperature so precisely regulated that Emeric had stopped feeling it years ago, the way a man stops feeling a ring he never removes. There was no smell to the place. He had paid a great deal of money to ensure that. Scent was memory, and memory was a liability. And Emeric had spent his adult life systematically removing every liability he could find until the only one left was the fact that he was still, technically, a human being. He stood now at the floor-to-ceiling window with an untouched glass of water in his hand, watching snow sift down through the sodium glow of the streetlights 40 floors below. Somewhere out there, 3 of his men were persuading a dockmaster to reconsider a shipment he had promised to a rival. Somewhere else, a courier was moving something heavy and illegal through a checkpoint that Emeric had paid to be blind. The machine ran. It always ran. He had built it to run without him, tuned it over 11 years until it needed his hand less and less. And lately, he had begun to suspect that it no longer needed his hand at all, that he had made himself, with great care and at enormous expense, entirely unnecessary to his own life. "The Renard contract came back signed," said Milos from the doorway. Emeric didn't turn. Milos had been at his side for 11 years since the night Emeric's father was carried out of a restaurant in 2 pieces, and a 19-year-old boy inherited a war he had not asked for and did not know how to end. Milos was broad and unhurried, with the flat, patient calm of a man who had stopped being afraid of dying a long time ago. He was the closest thing to a friend Emeric permitted himself, which was to say he was an employee who occasionally told the truth and who had learned exactly how much truth Emeric could tolerate in a given week. "Conrad's pleased," Milos added, when the silence stretched too long. "He says the Renard family controls the northern routes all the way to the border. Says the marriage settles the question of the border for a generation. Says your father would be proud. My father is dead. Pride is wasted on him." Emeric finally sipped the water. It was cold and tasted of nothing, which was how he took most things. And the woman, Céline Renard, 26, educated abroad, speaks 4 languages. Conrad says she's agreeable. Agreeable. Emeric let the words sit in the air like a coin on a table. He had met Céline Renard exactly once at a dinner arranged by his uncle, and he remembered almost nothing about her, except that she had laughed at the correct moments and worn a necklace worth more than most men in the flats earned in a decade. She had looked at him the way you look at a load-bearing wall, with respect and no curiosity at all, and a quiet private calculation of how much weight she could hang from him before he cracked. When does Conrad want it done? Spring? Before the shipping season opens, he wants the families joined before the ice breaks. Emeric nodded slowly. It was a good arrangement. It was, by every measure, His world used to measure such things: a triumph, a border secured, a rival made kin, a bloodline extended without a single shot fired. His father would have wept with pride if his father had been the weeping kind, which he emphatically had not been. He should have felt something. That was the part he had stopped mentioning, even to himself. Somewhere in the last several years, the feeling had gone out of things the way heat goes out of a room with the door left open, so gradually that he'd only noticed once the cold was total. He ran an empire of hungers, men who wanted money, wanted power, wanted women, wanted revenge. And he himself had stopped wanting anything at all. Money bored him. He had more than 3 lifetimes could spend. Fear bored him. He had watched it work on other men so many times it had lost all mystery. Women looked at his hands and his reputation and arranged their faces into whatever they imagined he wanted, and he could no longer remember the last time a single human voice had said something to him that wasn't calculated, first, for its effect on him. "Get some sleep, Emmerich," Milos said, not unkindly. "You look like hell." "I don't sleep, you know that." "I know, I said it anyway. Somebody should." Milos lingered a moment, as if there were more he wanted to say, then thought better of it. "Good night, boss." The door closed. Emmerich stood alone in the enormous quiet he had spent a fortune to build, and for a long moment he simply listened to it, the faultless hum of the hidden air, the tick of nothing, the absence he had once mistaken for peace, and now suspected was something closer to a held breath that had gone on so long he had forgotten how to let it out. Then he did what he did most nights. He went to his study, poured himself 2 fingers of something older than Milos, and sat in the dark with the small battered radio his father had kept on his desk his whole life. The one object in the entire penthouse that carried a smell, a faint ghost of pipe tobacco and old dust, and a man Emmerich had feared more than loved. He didn't know why he kept it. He wasn't sentimental. Sentiment, too, was a liability. He told himself he kept it, because sometimes, past midnight, the local stations went dark, and the far ones bled through, and a man who couldn't sleep needed something to fill the hours that wasn't the sound of his own thoughts circling the drain. He turned the dial through the hiss and the crackle, half listening, expecting nothing. The way he expected nothing, from most things. Now that was the night he found her. It started as almost nothing, a warmth, surfacing out of the static, the way a lit window appears at the far end of a dark street, and makes you realize, only then, how long you have been walking in the cold. "And if you're still awake out there," the voice was saying, "I want you to know that the fact you made it to 2 in the morning is not a failure. Some of us just take the night shift on being alive. That's all this is. You and me, keeping the light on till the sun comes back around to do its part." Emmerich's hand went still on the dial. It wasn't a beautiful voice, not in the way beauty was usually sold. It was low, and slightly rough at the edges, a voice with a crack running through it, like a bell that had been dropped once and rung truer for it afterward. She spoke slowly, unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world and had decided, out of everyone she could have given it to spend it on you specifically. There was no music behind her. No advertisements, no jingle, no smooth professional bumper, just the small, imperfect hum of a cheap microphone and a woman talking into the dark to whoever was left listening at the bottom of the night. "This next one's for a man who wrote in and didn't sign his name," she went on. "He says he's done things he can't take back. He says he doesn't think people like him get to start over, and he wants to know if it's too late for him." A pause. He could hear her breathe, hear the small catch of someone choosing her words with care. "I've been carrying your letter around all day. And here's where I keep landing. You're asking the wrong question. It's never really about whether it's too late. Time doesn't forgive anybody, it just passes, and it'll pass the same whether you change or you don't. The real question is a smaller one. It's whether you're willing to be a little different tomorrow than you were today, even if nobody claps for it, even if nobody ever knows you did it. That's the only kind of starting over that's real, in my experience. The kind you do alone, in the dark, for no reward at all. Emmerich realized he had stopped breathing. She could not have been speaking to him. It was impossible. A coincidence of the dark. A letter from some other ruined stranger read aloud on a signal so weak it probably reached a few hundred insomniacs and long-haul truckers on the ring road. And yet he sat forward in his chair, like a man who had heard his own name called, clean across a crowded room, and something behind his sternum, something he had assumed was scar tissue all the way through, gave a single slow ache, like a limb waking up. The station identified itself only once, muttered and half-swallowed under her sign-off, a little community frequency out past the industrial flats, the kind of low-watt operation run out of a back room by volunteers and held together with electrical tape and goodwill. She never gave her name. At the end of her 11 minutes she simply said, the way she must have said it 1,000 times before, "That's all the light I've got tonight. Go easy on yourselves out there. I'll be right here tomorrow." And then a click, and the hiss rushed back in, to fill the space where she had been. And Emmerich sat in the dark, holding a glass he had forgotten to drink. He told himself it meant nothing. He was tired. Tired men attached significance to noise. It was a documented weakness, and he did not intend to indulge it. He came back the next night anyway, and the night after that. It became the shape his darkness took. He would clear the study by one, send Milos home, dismiss the last of the men, and sit with the old radio warming under his palm, waiting for 2 o'clock and the small electric moment when the static parted like a curtain and she came through. She read letters from the lonely and the sleepless, a night shift nurse who hadn't seen the sun in a week, a widower who couldn't stand the silence of his own bed, a teenager, terrified of a future she couldn't picture, a man just out of prison who didn't know how to want things anymore. She never mocked them. She never offered them the cheap, bright, expensive lies that Emmerich had spent his whole life trading in. She just sat with them in the dark and told them the truth as gently as truth could possibly be told. And something in Emmerich that had gone hard and cold and quiet years before his father died began, entirely against his will, to thaw. He knew things about her, by the end of the second week, that he had no right to know. He knew she took her tea with far too much honey, because she'd laughed about it once, mid-sentence, and the laugh had undone him more than the words. He knew her heat went out sometimes, because he'd heard her apologize on air for the rattling of her own space heater. He knew she had lost someone. She never said who or how, because of the particular careful way she talked about grief, like a woman describing a room she still lived in and had simply learned to keep clean. He knew that she was, in some way, she never once named, as alone in the world as he was, and possibly more. Emmerich Solon, who could have had any piece of information in the city for the price of a single phone call, did not once have her looked into. This astonished him when he finally noticed it. He had the resources to know her legal name, her address, the color of her front door, and the contents of her bank account by breakfast. He chose not to. He was afraid, genuinely afraid, for the first time in more years than he could count, that if he made her real, if he turned even a fraction of his machine and his money and his quiet violence in her direction, she would stop being the one thing that was true in his life and become just another thing he owned. And she was the single thing he could not stand to ruin, precisely because she was the only thing he hadn't paid for. So he kept her the way he had found her, a voice in the dark, 11 minutes long, that asked nothing of him and somehow handed him back a piece of himself he'd assumed was gone into the ground with his father. He began to change in small ways. He told no one about. He let a man walk who, a year earlier, he would have buried without a second thought. He found himself, one gray afternoon, staring at the arranged papers of the Renard marriage and feeling not the familiar clean indifference, but a low and growing dread. The sense of a heavy door swinging slowly shut on a room he had never once lived in, and now, absurdly, too late, wanted to. Then on a Thursday, in the deep cold of February, 2 o'clock came and the dial gave him nothing but static. He waited. He told himself the signal was weak, that the weather was bad, that the little station had blown a fuse or lost a volunteer. He sat until 3, until 4, until the gray began to lift outside the black glass, and the city started, reluctantly, to wake. She didn't come back the next night either, or the one after that. And Emmerich Salan, who had taught himself, at great cost, to want nothing at all, discovered that the perfect silence he had paid a fortune to build around himself was the worst sound he had ever heard in his life. By the fourth night of silence, Emmerich had done something he had not done since he was 19 years old and kneeling on a restaurant floor in his father's blood. He had begun, quietly, to bargain with a god he did not believe in. He sat in the dark study with the dead radio warm under his hand and turned the dial back and forth across the empty frequency as if sheer persistence could conjure her out of the noise. Static, static. A farm report bleeding in from somewhere, far to the west, a bored man reading grain prices to no one. Static. He caught himself murmuring under his breath, come back, and stopped, appalled at himself, because he had not asked another living soul for anything in 11 years, and here he was begging a machine in an empty room. He knew, of course, what he was going to have to do. He had known it since the second night. The only reason he hadn't done it already was that doing it meant admitting, out loud and to another person, how far gone he was. On the fifth morning he called Milos into the study and told him. Milos listened the way he always did, motionless, his big hands folded in his lap, his face giving away nothing. And when Emmerich finished, there was a silence long enough to hang a man in. Let me make sure I understand, Milos said finally. You want me to find a woman. You don't have her name. You don't have her face. You have a radio station that runs on scrap metal and prayers out past the flats, and a voice you've been listening to at 2 in the morning for the better part of a month. He paused, letting each fact land with its full weight. And you didn't have her looked into. You, of all the careful, paranoid, trust-nothing bastards I have worked for in my life, you found something you wanted and you didn't run it. No. Why not? That's not you, Emmerich. That's the opposite of you. Emmerich looked at the old radio for a long moment. Because I didn't want to know anything about her that she hadn't chosen to tell me herself. Everyone in my life is a file. Every person who comes through that door, I know their debts and their weaknesses, and the names of the people they love before they finished shaking my hand. I wanted one thing in the world that wasn't a file. He turned the empty glass slowly on the desk. I wanted her to stay a person. Milos was quiet for a moment. Something moved behind his flat, careful eyes. Not mockery and not the exasperation Emmerich had braced for. Something closer to alarm. In 11 years he had watched Emmerich Barry, a father, break a rival syndicate down to its foundations and agree to marry Céline Renard without so much as a flicker of his pulse. He had never once, in all that time, watched the man want something. Emmerich, he said slowly, choosing his ground. You're getting married in the spring. Conrad has staked the entire northern border on it. He's promised the Renards adjoining, and Conrad does not enjoy being made a liar. If he finds out you're spending your nights chasing a ghost on the radio, Conrad isn't going to find out. Emmerich's voice didn't rise. It never rose. That was the thing that had always frightened people about him, that the worst moments of their lives arrived in the same low, even murmur he used to order coffee. Find her, Milos, quietly. No man on the ground near her, no leaning on anyone she'd notice. Nothing she will ever feel happening around her. I don't want her frightened. I don't want her touched. I want to know she's alive, and where, and then I want you to leave her exactly as you found her. That's all. He stopped. Then, because he had decided somewhere in the last 5 sleepless days to stop lying to himself, he made himself say the rest of it. There's one more thing you should know, so you understand what this is. Before she went dark, 3 weeks ago, maybe a little more, I wrote to the station. Millis went very still. You wrote to her. A letter, unsigned. I drove out past the flats myself in the middle of the night and put it in the station's box with my own hand. And Merrick's jaw tightened. I told her I had done things I couldn't take back. I asked her whether it was too late for a man like me. And she read it on the air. She didn't know it was me. She will never know it was me. Something that was almost a smile touched the corner of his mouth and died there before it could commit. She told me the only starting over that's real is the quiet kind. The kind nobody claps for. The kind you do alone. He looked up, and for once his eyes were not the eyes of a man who owned half a harbor and everyone working it. They were just tired and frightened and young. I have spent my entire life being clapped for Milos. Feared, flattered, and obeyed. She is the only person alive who ever told me the truth without knowing who I was, and that is the only reason on this earth that I was able to believe it. Milos didn't answer right away. He was a practical man, and every practical instinct he owned was screaming that this ended badly, that a man in Emmerich's position could not afford to love a thing he couldn't control, and that a disembodied voice in the dark was the least controllable thing there was. He thought hard about saying so. He thought about his duty, which was to protect Emmerich from every threat in the city, including the ones that came from inside Emmerich himself. Then he looked at his employer's face, really, looked at it, at the naked thing sitting in it, that he had never seen there before, and he closed his mouth. "I'll find her," he said instead. "Give me 2 days. It took him 3. Milos came back on the 3rd night, and he did not sit down, which was how Emmerich knew, before a single word had been spoken, that something was badly wrong. "I found the station," Milos said. "Little place, exactly like you described. Back room behind a shuttered print shop, out on Vessel Street, past the flats, where the map more or less gives up. 2 volunteers run it, an old man and a teenage kid. They don't pay anybody. They don't charge anybody. People just come in off the street and talk into the dark, and the old man keeps the lights on out of his pension." He set a folded slip of paper on the desk, but kept 2 fingers pressed flat on top of it, as if not yet ready to let it cross the distance between them. "The woman you've been listening to has had the 2 a.m. slot for a little over a year. On the air, she's just the night reader. She never let them use a name, not once. The old man told me that when she first walked in, she wouldn't give him anything to call her at all, so he started calling her Wren, after the bird, because she was small and brown, and you could hear her before you ever saw her. It stuck. But that's his name for her, not hers. Even he doesn't know her real one." Wren. Emmerich turned the small, borrowed sound of it over in his mind. It fit her, the way a key fits a lock you never knew was sitting in you, waiting. "She stopped coming 8 days ago," Milos went on, and here his voice changed, went careful. "The old man's beside himself. Said it wasn't like her. She'd never missed a single night. In over a year. Not through the ice storm in December. Not the week her heat died, and she broadcast in her coat with her breath showing. He said the last night she came in, she seemed off, quieter than usual, and she was quiet to begin with. She recorded her 11 minutes, and when she was done and it was time to go out into the dark, he offered to walk her to the bus stop like he sometimes did. She told him no. Told him she'd be fine." Milos finally lifted his fingers from the paper. "She wasn't fine. Nobody's seen her since. Not the old man, not the kid, not anyone on that street." Emmerich was already on his feet. "The address, Emmerich? The address, Milos? That's the part you'll want to be sitting down for, and I know you won't, so I'll just put it in front of you." Milos exhaled slowly. "The reason it took me the extra day is that there is almost nothing on this woman anywhere. No lease in any name I could match to her, no utilities, no cards, no bank, no phone in her own name, and no record of her arriving in the city at all that I could find. A grown woman, living like she was, actively trying not to leave a single fingerprint on the world. The only steady thread in her whole life is a free clinic near the flats. She comes in for a prescription, pays cash every 3 weeks, regular as a clock, for over a year. He paused. She missed the last pickup 6 days ago. First time she's ever missed it. Something cold slid down the back of Emmerich's neck and settled at the base of his spine. A prescription for what? They wouldn't tell me. Clinics like that guard that kind of thing. Harder than the banks guard their vaults, and I promised you I wouldn't lean. But the pharmacist let one thing slip. When I asked him gently whether she was all right, Milos held Emmerich's eyes and would not look away from them. He said, "That poor girl, that's all. Just that poor girl." The way you'd say it about someone the world had already done its worst to. Like it cost him something every time he handed the bag across the counter. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside the black glass, the snow had started again, drifting down soundlessly past 40 floors. Emmerich became aware of his own heartbeat, which was a thing he almost never noticed, and it was going faster than the plain facts could account for, because the facts, laid out cold, amounted only to this. A stranger he had never met and could not name had missed some appointments. His rational mind, the one that had kept him alive through a decade of men who wanted him dead, had a great deal to say about it. You do not know this woman. You have never seen her face. You are the head of a family, you are 6 weeks from a marriage that secures the entire northern border, and you are about to walk out into the worst part of the city in the dead of a February night over a voice whose real name you learned 90 seconds ago from another man. He heard every word of it, and then he reached out and set the old radio down, gently on the desk. The way you set down something that has kept you alive when you no longer need it in your hands to be brave. Where, he said, is she? A room above a laundry, east end of the flats past the canal, in the stretch where the streetlights stopped working years ago and the city stopped bothering to fix them. Milos said it quietly, because he had already lost the argument he had been too wise to actually start. Emmerich, if she's been missing 8 days in that part of the city, then you and I both know the shape of what we're likely to find at the top of those stairs. People go into the East Flats and they don't always come back out. You know that better than anyone alive. You have made that happen to people, more than once, with a phone call from this exact room. So whatever's waiting up there, I need you to be ready for it to be bad. I've seen badly, Emmerich said, already pulling his coat from the back of the chair. Not like this, Milos said, and his voice was almost gentle. You've never once in your life gone looking for the worst, hoping with everything in you to be wrong. Emmerich stopped at the door. He did not turn around. No, he admitted, to the dark hallway ahead of him, rather than to Milos. I never have. And he went out into the snow. The city changed by slow degrees as they drove, the way a long-held note slides gradually, sickeningly flat. The black glass towers of the harbor district gave way to older stone, and the older stone gave way to brick, gone soft and dark with 100 years of soot, and then even the brick seemed to give up on itself. Out past the frozen canal, the buildings hunched low and crooked under the weight of the snow, their windows papered over from the inside or punched out entirely and stuffed with rags, their doorways full of a shadow that the headlights couldn't seem to reach into. The streetlights stood dead at their posts like a row of hanged men. Milos had said it in the study, and it was exactly true. Out here the light simply stopped, as though the city had drawn a hard line across a map one day, and quietly decided that whatever happened on the far side of it was no longer any of the city's business. Emmerich sat in the back of the car with his hands loose and open on his knees and watched it all slide past the glass. And the strangest thing was happening inside him. The closer they came to her, the calmer he grew. It was the calm he had first learned as a boy, standing at the lip of his father's grave with a shovel in his hands. The terrible, useful, hollow stillness that arrived when a thing finally became too large to be afraid of in any ordinary way. He had spent a month falling in love with a warmth in the dark. Now he was driving straight into the exact kind of place his warmth had spent every single night talking frightened people through, and he understood, with a clarity that unsettled him more than any threat on his own life ever had, that he would take this entire frozen district apart, with his bare hands, brick by brick by brick, before he would ever drive home not knowing. There, Milos said. The laundry was a low, sagging building with a cracked plastic sign gone dark, its machines silent behind a window filmed with grime. Beside its door a second, narrower door stood recessed back into the brick, and above it a single window on the second floor showed no light at all, not the blue flicker of a television, not the warm smear of a lamp, nothing. Milos killed the engine. The silence that rushed in to replace it was enormous, a physical pressure against the ears. "Let me go up first," Milos said. "Please." "No, Emmerich, you'll stay with the car. Keep it running, keep it warm, and keep it pointed at the road." Emmerich was already opening his door. The cold came into the car, like a living thing, sharp and total, carrying the wet stone smell of the canal, the iron of rust, and something underneath both of them that he made the deliberate choice not to name. "If I'm not back down in 10 minutes, then you come up." Not 1 second before, he crossed the dead street alone. His own footsteps were the only sound in the entire world, a soft crunch of new snow over old ice. The narrow door was unlocked, but not merely unlocked, he saw as he got close. It had been broken open. The cheap latch was splintered clean out of the frame, the raw, pale wood showing through where the paint had torn, and no one had ever come to fix it. The sight of that splintered wood put a cold, specific weight into his stomach that all of Milos's careful warnings had not managed to. He pushed the door wide. The hinges made no sound at all, which was somehow far worse than if they had screamed. The stairwell climbed up into a darkness that the little light from the street couldn't follow. It smelled of damp plaster and cold laundry soap, and underneath, faint but unmistakable, the scorched dust smell of an electric space heater that had been run too long and too hard, and that last smell stopped him dead with one gloved hand on the frozen iron rail, because he knew it. He had heard her apologize for it. He had sat 40 floors above the sleeping city, in a room that cost more than this entire building, and listened to a woman say, "Sorry about the racket, my heat's acting up again," and he had smiled in the dark like an absolute fool, and now he was standing inside the actual cold she had been apologizing for, and it was so much worse than a sound could ever have prepared him for. He climbed. The wooden stairs groaned in protest under his weight, each one a small betrayal, announcing him to whatever waited above. Somewhere far below, water dripped in the dark, with the flat, endless patience of something that had been dripping for years and expected to drip for years more. At the very top there was a single door, its paint blistered and peeling in long curls, and along its edge showed a thin, vertical thread of a darker dark where it hung, very slightly open. Emmerich stopped in front of it. His heart was going hard now, and for once he let it, made no attempt to master it. For the length of one single breath, he was not a man who owned a harbor and half the men who worked it. He was just a man standing at a door at 2 o'clock in the morning at the far frozen edge of the world, about to see at last the face that belonged to the only voice that had ever told him the truth. He pushed the door open, and what he saw in that small, freezing room took the breath out of him as cleanly and completely as a blade slid between the ribs. The room was smaller than the closet off his study, and colder than the street he had just left. A single candle guttered on top of an overturned crate. Because the power was gone, he understood that at once from the dead lamp in the corner, and the silent space heater lying uselessly on its side, its cord trailing to an outlet that gave it nothing. The candlelight was thin and orange and shook with every draft, and in its unsteady reach, Emmerich took in the whole of her life at a single glance. A thin mattress lay directly on the floorboards with a nest of mismatched blankets, a short stack of swollen second-hand paperbacks, a chipped enamel mug, and a cheap microphone wired to a battered laptop. The two of them bound together with the same electrical tape that held the station together, the tools she had used, night after night, to keep 100 strangers company in the dark while she froze. There was almost nothing else in the room. No photographs, no decoration, no comfort. She had lived exactly the way Milos had described her, like a person deliberately trying not to leave a mark on the world that anyone could follow. And on the mattress, half sitting against the bare wall, with a blanket clutched up to her chest in one fist, was the woman. She was younger than her voice had led him imagine, perhaps 30, with dark hair matted flat to her forehead by the sweat of a hard fever, and a body gone frighteningly, wrongly thin inside an oversized man sweater that was not hers. But none of that was what stopped him. What stopped him? What struck the air out of his lungs and drove him a full, involuntary step backward into the doorframe was her face. The left side was simply hers, a good face, tired and human and real, with a sharp, clever mouth and a fine dark brow, and an eye that even now was trying to focus. The right side was ruin. A burn scar ran from the line of her jaw, up across her cheek to her temple, and back into the hair, old and long, healed but savage in its geography. The skin drawn smooth and shining and pale and tight, pulling faintly at the corner of her eye. Someone had done this to her a long, long time ago. Fire, and a great deal of it, and no gentle or expensive hands anywhere afterward to soften what it left behind or make it look like anything other than exactly what it was. Her eyes came open at the sound of the door striking the wall. They were unfocused, glassy, and too bright with fever, and they found him standing in the doorway, and they did not scream. "You're not supposed to be here." The voice hit him like a hand closing around his heart. It was her, unmistakably and completely her, the low, rough crack of it, the terrible, unearned gentleness, even now, but hoarse, scraped down to almost nothing, a bell with the clapper broken. "Whoever sent you, tell them I already paid. I paid what I owed and more. Tell them—" She stopped. Focus swam up briefly through the fever, and she truly looked at him for the first time, at the coat that cost more than the building he was standing in, at the stillness of a man who was not from anywhere near here. "You're not one of theirs," she whispered, and something in her seemed to fold at the strangeness of it. "Who are you?" Emmerich could not speak. For a moment, the man who always had the next word, the man whose murmured sentences ended arguments and lives, had nothing at all. For a month he had been building her a face in the dark. He had never once given that imagined face a scar, because it had never once occurred to him that it might need one. The voice had been whole and warm and unmarked, and he understood now, with a slow wave of self-disgust that started in his chest and spread outward, that some soft, cowardly part of him had simply assumed the rest of her matched it. That the world was at bottom fair. And here was the actual truth of her, shaking with fever on a mattress, on the floor of a freezing room, hiding a face that someone, somewhere, at some point in her life, had taught her the world could not bear to look at, and still, dragging herself up a flight of groaning stairs to a taped-together microphone every single night, for over a year to tell frightened strangers that they deserved to be gentle with themselves. She had never let the station use a name. She had never once let the old man walk her to the bus. She had lived without a lease, or a card, or a light left burning in a window, a woman who had organized the entire architecture of her life around the single principle of not being seen. Because somewhere behind her, in a fire she carried on her face, someone had taught her in the cruelest possible way. And he, Emmerich Solon, who owned the harbor and 100 men and a fortune and a marriage that would join 2 empires, he had gone and fallen hopelessly in love with the one and only part of herself she had ever been willing to send out into the world. Her voice. The single piece of her she had decided she could trust the dark to carry safely, precisely because the dark couldn't see her. "I know you," he heard himself say at last. His own voice came out wrecked, unrecognizable to him. "I've been listening to you. 2 o'clock every night, for a month. Yours is the only voice in this whole city I've wanted to hear in longer than I can remember." He took one step into the freezing room, and then he did a thing he had not done in front of another living soul since he was a boy. At that grave, he lowered himself all the way down to his knees, beside the mattress, so that his ruined $1,000 coat pooled on the filthy floorboards around him, so that he was below her, so that for once in her life she would not have to tip her chin up to look at one more large man standing over her in the dark. "You read a letter on the air, from a man who signed nothing. He told you he'd done things he couldn't take back, and asked if it was too late for him. And you told him it's never about too late. That the only real starting over is the quiet kind, the kind nobody claps for." His throat closed hard around the words. "I was that man. I wrote that letter. It was me. You've already saved my life once, and you never even knew you did it." Her fevered eyes went wide, and for a moment the whole of her stopped, the shivering, the labored breath, all of it suspended. And then Wren, the night reader, the voice in the dark, the woman who had spent a year giving away for free a comfort that not one single person had ever thought to offer back to her, began, silently, without a sound, to cry. He didn't touch her yet. He was afraid to. Afraid his hands, which had done so much harm, would frighten her, or hurt her, or simply be one more thing taken from her without asking. So he took off his coat instead and laid it over her shaking shoulders, and the sheer size of it swallowed her whole, and she let him do it, let the weight of it settle on her without flinching. And somehow that small surrender told him more about how far past the edge she was than the fever or the crying had. "You're burning up," he said, low and even, working to keep every trace of the other thing out of his voice. "There's a wound somewhere. Where is it?" "Let me see." She didn't answer, so he found it himself. Her right hand, the one she had kept tucked out of sight beneath the blanket the entire time, angled away from him on instinct. Two of the fingers were splinted with a snapped pencil and a torn strip of cloth, bound clumsily, unmistakably, by someone trying to tend her own injuries, one-handed in the dark. And the wrist above them was swollen and hot and wrong, an old injury that had never been given the chance to heal clean. Infection had already climbed the inside of her forearm halfway to the elbow, an angry, spreading warmth of it under the skin. "Who did this?" Emmerich said, and he heard the thing come up into his own voice unbidden. The low, flat, terrible thing that had made grown men confess to crimes they had not committed, just to make it stop. He caught it and forced it back down, hard. She had spent her whole life around men who sounded like that. He would sooner cut out his own tongue than become one more of them tonight. "Wren, look at me. I am not going to hurt you. Not now, not ever, not for anything. But I need to know who did this, and I need to know it right now, because that infection is in your blood, and if you don't let me carry you out of this room, you are going to die in it. So tell me, who?" The name, when it finally came, was one he knew. "Dravik," she whispered. Everything inside Emmerich went cold and still and very quiet. Antoon Dravik ran the collections and kept the debt book for the entire east end of the flats, a mid-level man, small and vicious, who operated with the quiet tolerance of the family precisely because he kept the poorest and most desperate quarter of the whole city bled thin and silent and paying. He worked at 3 removes up a chain of handlers and capos for Emmerich. He was in the only sense that had ever mattered in Emmerich's world. Emmerich's man. His cruelty happened under Emmerich's name, with Emmerich's money, in Emmerich City. "Why?" Emmerich said very carefully. "Why would a man like Dravik ever have reason to touch you?" She was crying again, but the fever seemed to have loosened something in her, torn down some wall she'd have kept standing on any ordinary day, and the truth came out of her in broken pieces between shallow breaths. She had come to the flats 4 years ago. After the fire, she did not say what the fire had been, only that it had taken her face and her younger sister from her both on the same night, and that she had come to the East End because it was the one corner of the city where nobody looked at anybody else long enough to remember them. She had made herself invisible on purpose. She'd taken quiet cash work, cleaning the very free clinic where she picked up the medicine that kept the tightening scar tissue from slowly strangling the nerves along her jaw. And every night, without fail, she had climbed those stairs to that taped-together microphone and been a warm voice in the dark for people who had even less than she did. Then, a little over 3 weeks ago, a boy had come to her door, 16 years old, a runner for Dravik, shaking with terror. Dravik had marked his mother's debt as unpaid, when in plain fact it had been paid in full, and meant to take the boy in her place, to work the phantom balance off on the docks, which was a thing boys went to do and did not always come back from. The boy had nowhere on earth to go, but he'd grown up falling asleep to the night reader's voice on a cheap radio, and so he'd come, in the end, to the only warm voice he had ever known. "So I hid him," Wren whispered, "and there was no apology anywhere in it. That's all I did. I hid one frightened child, and I had the proof his debt was already paid." His mother had kept the receipt book, Dravik's own handwriting in it, showing how the family had been cooking the numbers for years, taking 2 and 3 times what was actually owed off half the households in the flats, and pocketing the difference. Her ruined hand twitched faintly under the coat. "Dravik came for me 8 days ago. He wanted the book back, and he wanted the boy, and he wanted to know where I'd hidden both. I wouldn't tell him." A ghost of the voice he'd fallen in love with came through then, cracked and defiant and impossibly brave. "So, he hurt me badly. And he kept asking, and I still wouldn't tell him. And then his own people got frightened. Someone in that much pain makes noise for that long, and noise draws the wrong kind of attention, even out here, so they stopped. And they left me on this floor to finish it quietly on my own." She almost laughed. "I've been at it 8 days now. Turns out I'm very bad at giving up quietly." "The book," Emmerich said. "Where is it now?" "Inside the space heater," she breathed, her eyes sliding half shut. "Behind the coils, in the base. Nobody looks inside a broken heater." "Why do you?" "'Cause it was hard proof that a man who answered to Emmerich had spent years robbing the very poorest people in Emmerich City blind under Emmerich's name, and had hurt a woman badly enough to leave her for dead in a freezing room to keep it buried. And because Anton Dravik did not know, could not possibly have imagined, that the warm voice he had tried to silence in the dark belonged to the same woman the head of the entire family had just spent the last 5 minutes kneeling in front of on a filthy floor, learning it long. Brutal last what his clean and quiet empire actually cost the people at the bottom of it. Emmerich rose to his feet. Somewhere in the last 10 minutes the exhaustion had gone out of him for good, and the thing that had come in to fill the space it left was very old and very cold and absolutely sure of itself. "We're leaving," he said right now. "And before this is finished, Anton Dravik is going to wish to God his men had done a more thorough job of making sure you were dead." Milos came up at the 10-minute mark, exactly. Gun held low along his thigh, and he stopped dead in the doorway at the sight in front of him. His employer down on the floor of a freezing empty room, his own coat wrapped around the shoulders of a scarred half-conscious woman he was easing up into his arms. "Get the car right to the door," Emmerich said, and there was no discussion left in his voice. Only command. "Call Sabin. Wake him, I don't care. Tell him East Wing Suite, full kit, blood on hand, every antibiotic he's got. Tell him a wrist wound gone septic, 8 days old, into the blood, and that if he loses her I will take it as a personal failure of his and treat it accordingly." He was sliding one arm behind her back and the other beneath her knees as he spoke. "And Milos, when we've gone, send one of our people back up here to that space heater behind the coils. In the base, there's a book, a ledger. You bring it to me yourself, and you let no one else in this world so much as breathe on it, it's worth more than the building. Ren made a small, broken sound of protest as he lifted her clear of the mattress. I can walk. You can't, Emmerich said, and his voice cracked on it. You weigh nothing. You weigh less than nothing, and that's a crime all its own, and I'll deal with the man responsible for it in due time. She weighed, in fact, so little in his arms that it made his jaw ache and his eyes sting. This woman who had carried 100 strangers through the longest nights of their lives, who had held on to a terrified child's freedom through the deliberate breaking of her own fingers, and who had eaten so little for so long that a large man could lift her one-handed and barely feel it. He carried her down the groaning stairs and out through the splintered door into the falling snow, and against the cold she turned her ruined face inward into his chest, and he felt something deep inside him settle, silently and permanently, into a shape it would hold for the rest of his life. In the car, with her unconscious and slack against his side and the heater roaring at full, Milas drove hard through the empty streets and said the thing he was duty-bound to say. Emmerich, Dravik collects for the whole East Flats. That is a family franchise sanctioned from the top. Para, you move on him tonight, over a woman and a debt book, and every capo underneath Conrad is going to want to know why the boss burned one of his own earners for a stranger from the slums. He hesitated, then pushed on, because that was his job. And Conrad, the Renard wedding, is 6 weeks out. You light a fire inside your own house, this close to the border marriage, and Conrad will read it as exactly one thing: that you've gone soft, that you're unfit to hold what your father left you. And then he moves. You know your uncle. You know he moves. I know, Emmerich said. Then think, for God's sake, think it all the way through before you. I have thought. Emmerich watched the dead streetlights slide past the window, one after another, none of them lit. I've done nothing but think for 11 years. I built the quietest, cleanest, most profitable machine this city has ever seen. And I told myself the flats were simply the cost of doing business, a line at the bottom of a page, and I never once, in all that time, drove out to look at what that cost actually was, in fingers, in faces, in girls left to die quietly on the floor. He turned his head from the window, and Milos caught the look on his face in the rearview mirror and stopped talking mid-thought. A man who works for me nearly killed the single good thing in this entire city for the sake of a receipt book. That happened under my name. It happened because I built a world where it was allowed to happen, and then I very carefully arranged never to look directly at it. That ends tonight, Milos. Not just Dravik. The border, the money, the Renard marriage. The whole arrangement I built my life on top of. All of it ends tonight, because I have finally seen with my own eyes exactly what it's made of. He reached into the coat that now smelled of her, of fever and blood and scorched dust and the cold, and pulled out the burner phone and made 2 calls. The first was to Conrad's people. He canceled the Renard marriage in a single flat sentence, offered no reason for it whatsoever, and hung up before the shouting on the other end could properly begin. The second was to the 4 men in the whole city he trusted with his own life, and he told each of them, in that same low, even murmur, exactly where to be and when, before the sun came up. Then he sat in the dark of the moving car with a dying woman held carefully against him, driving away at speed from everything he had spent his entire life building, and for the first time since he was 19 years old and orphaned into a war, Emmerich Solon knew, without a flicker of doubt, precisely who he was. Sabin worked on her for 2 hours in the East Wing suite, while Emmerich stood at the tall window, with his arms folded, and refused, flatly and repeatedly, to leave the room. The verdict, when Sabin finally straightened and delivered it, was a narrow one. The infection had been, by his estimate, a single day, perhaps 2, from reaching her heart. 2 of the broken fingers would knit crooked and never be entirely straight again. She was severely, dangerously malnourished. Sabin used the clinical word carefully and quietly, the same careful quiet with which Milos's pharmacist had said, "That poor girl." But she would live. The fever would break before dawn. And the scar, Sabin added, lowering his voice further as he packed his instruments away, was many years old and had been left to heal entirely on its own, without a single skilled hand to tend it. Whoever had pulled this woman clear of that fire had saved her life in the doing and then left her to survive the aftermath, completely alone. Her sister, Emmerich said. It was not a question. He had assembled it on the drive, from the pieces she'd given him. She was the one who went back into the fire. She pulled her sister out, and there was no one left standing on the other side to pull her out but herself. Sabin didn't answer him, which was, in the end, its own kind of answer. She woke near dawn. Emmerich was in the chair drawn up close beside the bed, where he had sat unmoving for hours, and he watched her surface out of the dark, watched the exact moment she registered the warmth of the room, the clean weight of the sheets, the total absence of pain for the first time in 8 days. And then he watched the other thing arrive, the flash of pure animal fear, as a lifetime of hard instinct told her that waking somewhere warm and cared for meant she had, somehow without agreeing to it, incurred a debt she had no possible way to pay. "It's paid," he said quietly, before she could get a single frightened word out. "Whatever you're about to ask me, whatever you think all of this is going to cost you, it's already paid. In full, forever. You don't owe me anything. You are never going to owe me anything." "That's not what this is." Her eyes moved slowly over his face, searching it for the lie, for the angle, for the price hidden in the fine print. And then, slowly, she did the thing that undid him completely. She lifted her unhurt hand and pressed it flat against the right side of her own face, over the scar, and turned that side away from him, into the pillow, hiding it. The pure reflex of 4 years, so deep in her now that even here, even safe, even barely conscious, she could not switch it off. Emmerich leaned forward, and very gently, with 2 fingers beneath her chin, he turned her face back toward him. "No," he said softly. "Not with me. You don't ever have to do that with me." He held her gaze. "Listen to me, because I need you to understand this one thing if you never believe another word I say. I fell in love with you, in the dark, when I couldn't see you at all, when you were nothing to me but a voice coming out of a broken radio at 2 in the morning. Do you understand what that means? It means I did not fall in love with a face. I fell in love with the single, bravest voice in this entire city. And this," his thumb moved, once lightly, along the healed edge of the scar, and she went utterly still beneath the touch. "This is not something to be hidden from me. This is just the map of everything that voice survived to reach me. I am not going to look away from it. I'm going to look at it every morning for the rest of my life. And every morning I'm going to be grateful, past speaking, that you're still here to have it." She started to cry again, but it was different this time. Not the silent, exhausted, leaking of a woman with nothing left, but something deeper cracking open all at once. Something that had been sealed shut for years. "You don't even know my name," she whispered. "Not my real one. Nobody does." "Then tell me. The real one. Not the one the old man gave you at the station, because you wouldn't give him yours." And she told him the true name. The one she had buried along with her sister and her old face and everything she had been before the fire. He said it back to her once, softly, learning the exact shape and weight of it in his own mouth. And then, because she had just trusted him with the very worst and most hidden thing she owned, he told her his, in return. The whole of it. The entire truth, the harbor and the family and the blood on his hands, all of it, sparing himself nothing. He watched her come to understand precisely what kind of man was sitting at her bedside, holding her ruined hand. And then he watched her decide, with her eyes open, to stay anyway. Down in the compound below, tires crunched over frozen gravel as a car came in through the gates. Milos, with the receipt book in his hands, and with news. Dravik had heard that the boss had come to the flats in the night, and Antoon Dravik was already running. Emmerich spread the receipt book open across the wide surface of the desk in his study, and the full size of the thing settled over him like a slow, cold tide coming in over flat sand. It was worse, far worse, than even she had known. Dravik hadn't simply doubled one family's debt to steal a boy. Page after page after page, in his own cramped and careful hand, recorded years of it. The entire east end of the flat squeezed twice, 3 times over, household by household. The skimmed difference tracked in a second column and passed steadily upward along a chain that Emerich's practiced eye could read as easily as a map of his own city. Up from Dravik to his handler. Up from the handler to a capo Emmerich had trusted for a decade. And from that capo the line ran clean and unbroken and undeniable straight up to Conrad, his uncle. The architect of the Renard border. The man who 6 short weeks from a wedding meant to crown him the indispensable genius of the family's entire future, had been quietly and patiently bleeding the very poorest quarter of the city dry to fund his own private moves, and who had, less than 3 hours ago— "He's not running from you because of the marriage," Wren said. She had flatly refused to stay in the bed. She sat now wrapped in a heavy blanket in the wheeled chair Emmerich had rolled around to the front of the desk for her, her splinted hand cradled in her lap, her scarred face turned fully and deliberately toward the light of the desk lamp, a small, conscious act of trust that he had noticed the instant she did it, and had said nothing about, because saying something would have made it into a moment, and she'd had enough moments made of her. Her voice was still cracked and thin, but the mind working behind it was the exact one he had fallen in love with, in the dark, sharp, unhurried, and already turning the pages faster than he could follow. "Dravik's a franchise holder," she went on, tapping a page. "Small despite of. Everybody above him knows it, including him. He came after me over a book that means absolutely nothing. On its own, a low man's skimming. They'd have shrugged at it. It only becomes a death sentence when someone reads it all the way up the chain and sees whose name is sitting at the top." She looked up at him. "Conrad? And Conrad already knows you canceled the border wedding barely an hour after you carried a woman out of his east flats. He's not a fool. That's the one thing your uncle has never been. By now he's connected the two. He knows that you know, then he moves first," Emmerich said. It wasn't a question either. "He moves tonight," she answered, with a terrible flat certainty. "He has no other choice left. That book is proof he's been stealing for years from the family's own protected territory. And that isn't a rivalry. That's a capital crime under your own laws, the kind every other coppa will line up to punish the second they see the pages, if only to prove it wasn't them. His single remaining play is to take you out before you can put this book in front of them. A quiet accident. Tonight, before the ink is even dry on the cancelled wedding." She said it in the calm, level tone of a woman who had spent a solid year listening to frightened people in the dark and had learned, out of pure necessity, to hear the true shape of a threat sitting underneath the words. "So he'll either come here for you, or he'll find a way to draw you out somewhere quiet. But it's tonight, Emmerich. It has to be. And right now, you are the only thing standing between that book and the end of Conrad's life." Emmerich looked at her across the desk for a long moment. This woman who, only hours ago, had been dying alone and forgotten on the floor of a freezing room, and who was now reading the coming collapse of his own empire out of a stolen ledger faster and cleaner and with more nerve than any lieutenant he had ever employed. "You should be in bed," he said. "And you should be afraid," she shot back. "You're not. You haven't been. Not once, all night, and that frightens me a great deal more than your uncle does." A ghost of the old radio warmth crept unbidden into her ruined voice. "Don't do this. Don't make me spend the very first night of whatever this is between us planning your funeral. I've buried more people than I can stand to already, Emmerich. Don't you dare make me bury one more." Something moved hard in his chest. He came around the desk and lowered himself to a crouch in front of her chair so that they were level, eye to eye, the same way he had knelt on the floor of that freezing room the moment he first saw her face. "I am not going to draw this out, and I am not going to lose," he said, low and quiet and sure. "I know exactly where Conrad will send them, and I know precisely what they'll be coming for, and I am going to be there waiting in the dark when they arrive. You are going to stay right here, in this room, behind a door that Milo's does not leave for any reason at all. And when it's finished, I'm going to come back up those stairs, and I'm going to knock, and I'm going to tell you with my own mouth that it's done." He took her unhurt hand in both of his. "And then I am going to make you a cup of tea with a truly obscene amount of honey in it, and you are never ever, as long as you live, going to sleep in a cold room again." She gripped his hand hard enough that the bones shifted. "Come back," she said, and it was the whole of everything she had. "That's the entire request. Just come back to me." They came for him exactly the way he had known they would. Quiet, professional, careful, drawn out to the old family boat shed on the North Quay by a message. Conrad had sent 9 men. Emmerich found that almost flattering. It meant his uncle, even now, still respected what he could do. Emmerich brought 4, and the darkness, and the fact that he had walked every plank and shadow of these particular quays since before most of Conrad's men had learned to hold a gun. He let them come. He let them file in through the wide door of the shed and spread out among the dry-docked hulls and the coiled ropes, into the thick smell of tar and cold salt water. Hunting through the dark for a lone man they were certain was cornered and waiting to be killed. And then, on Emmerich's signal, Milo's cut the last working light, and the entire shed dropped into a black so complete it had weight. And in that instant Emmerich's 4 men became the only living people in the building who already knew, by heart, exactly where every wall and hull and open channel of water was. It was fast. It was not loud. Emmerich had built his entire life on the single principle that noise was for men who had already lost control of a room, and he did not, at any point, lose control of the room. It was over almost before it began. A few muffled, unremarkable sounds in the dark, and then a heavy, ringing silence. When it lifted, Conrad's men had been disarmed and put down where they stood, and only one was left on his knees, hands spread open and empty in front of him, weeping openly, because he had recognized the shape of the man walking slowly toward him out of the black. Conrad, of course, had not come himself. Of course he hadn't. He had sent the weeping man to lead it, and stayed home clean. Emmerich crouched down in front of the kneeling man and spoke to him gently, which was, to anyone who knew him, far more frightening than shouting could ever have been. "You're going to carry a message to my uncle for me," he said. "You're going to tell him the receipt book is real, that it's in my hands, and that by noon today, every capo in this family will be holding his own copy of it. You're going to tell him they will all read, in his own men's handwriting, that he has spent years stealing from our own people, in our own protected territory, to line his own pockets. You're going to tell him the flats are closed to him. The border is closed to him. The family is closed to him. There is no corner of this city left where his name means anything but a debt to be collected." He leaned in close. "And then you're going to tell him the reason it all came apart on him. Tell him one of his own men hurt a woman in the East End over that book, and left her on the floor for dead in the cold. Tell him she survived. Tell him she lived, and she read every page, and she's the one who read him." His sentence tonight, his voice dropped until it was barely more than breath. "Tell my uncle, the night reader, sends her regards." He stood, and he stepped back, and he let the weeping man scramble up and run out into the dark. Antoon Dravik, they ran down before the sun cleared the water at the far end of the quays, trying to buy his way onto a barge headed downriver, offering the ferryman a wet fistful of cash, and when that failed, a stammering, cowardly confession to everything. Emeric didn't need to raise a hand to him. Men, like Dravik, collapsed the moment the power they'd borrowed was taken away. But he made certain, in that final moment before Dravik was taken away to answer for all of it, that the man understood exactly whose warm voice in the dark had finally brought him low, that the invisible, scarred, throwaway woman he had hurt and left for dead in a freezing room had been the one single thing in all the world that the man who owned that world would burn every last brick of it to the ground to protect. He wanted Dravik to carry that knowledge with him for the rest of his days, that he had reached, blind and greedy, into the one place his master would have given anything to keep safe. And then it was done. Gray light was coming up cold and clean over the moving water, and Emeric stood alone at the very edge of the quay and let the raw river wind scour across his face and through his hair. He had ended in a single night. The entire arrangement, his whole life had been built to serve. He had cancelled the border, broken his own uncle, and turned his flawless quiet machine completely inside out, every bit of it, between one dusk and one dawn, for a voice he had followed down into the dark on nothing but faith. He had never once, in his entire life, felt so much like a man who was finally fully awake. He got in the car, and he went home to tell her it was done. The study door was locked when he reached the top of the stairs, and Emeric almost smiled at it. He had told her to stay behind a door, that Milos would not leave, and she had done exactly that, and the small, ordinary, astonishing fact of it, that she had trusted him enough to simply wait, undid something in him that none of the night's violence had come close to touching. He knocked, twice, soft. "It's me." He heard it all through the door, the rustle of the heavy blanket, the slow scrape of the wheeled chair she was still using to move, the heavy iron slide of the deadbolt drawing back. Then the door opened, and there was her face, scarred, exhausted, hollow-eyed, and turned fully and openly up to meet his in the lamplight, without a flinch, without a hand rising to hide the ruined side of it. And that was the exact moment Emeric Solian finally understood that he had not saved this woman at all. Not really. She had walked out of that freezing room on her own broken power, carrying a boy's freedom and a stolen ledger and the whole weight of her own survival, and she had simply, at the last, permitted him to carry her the rest of the way, the same way she permitted the dark to carry her voice out to strangers, because some quiet, ferocious, done-broken part of her had looked at him and decided, against every hard lesson of her life, that he was safe to be seen by. "It's done," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, at the cold of the night still clinging to his cuffs, the salt of the river drying in his hair, the coat he no longer made any pretense of keeping clean. Then she reached up with her unhurt hand and laid the palm flat against the center of his chest, over his heart, the way a person checks a thing they were afraid had stopped to see if it is somehow impossibly still running. "You came back," she said. "I told you I would. People tell me things all the time." Her cracked voice wavered and nearly broke. "You're the first one in 4 years who ever went out and did the thing he said he'd do." He covered her small hand with his own large one and held it there against his heartbeat. Behind him, through the tall windows, the sky over the black glass of the city was going pale and gold with a hard winter dawn, the first sunrise either of them had watched come up in a very long time, without some part of them dreading what its light would reveal. "I cancelled the marriage," he said quietly. "I broke my uncle. I've closed the flats to every man who bled them. By tonight I'll have handed the whole East End over to people who will run it clean and fair, and it is going to cost me more money than you could count in a year, and I promise you, I have never in my life cared less about money than I do standing here right now." He lifted her hand from his chest and held it between both of his splint and crooked fingers and all, as carefully as if it were spun glass. "I built an entire world stone by careful stone for one single purpose, to keep myself from ever having to feel anything again." And then a voice came out of a broken radio at 2 o'clock in the morning, and told a stranger who'd given up on himself that it is never ever too late to be different. And I believed her. I'm still believing her. And I would very much like to go on believing her, every night, for the rest of my life, if she'll have a man like me. Wren, the night reader, the woman who had given her warmth away freely into the dark every single night for a year, and never once, not one time, been offered any of it back, looked up at the dangerous, gentle, ruined man, standing there holding her broken hand as though it were the most valuable thing in the entire city. And she felt the last high wall inside her, the one she'd built with her own hands out of grief, and fear and 4 years of hiding, quietly come down. "The station's going to want its reader back," she whispered, and there were tears standing in her eyes. But she was smiling through them now. There are people out there, at 2 in the morning, in the cold and the dark, with nobody. They need somebody to keep the light on for them. "Then we'll keep it on," he said, without a heartbeat's hesitation. "Both of us, from right here. I'll build you the strongest signal this city has ever had, and I will sit up beside you every single night while you talk, the lonely ones all the way home." His voice, the same low murmur that had frightened powerful men into confessing crimes they hadn't committed, was barely a breath now. "I spent my whole life owning all the silence in this city. Let me spend the rest of it keeping yours safe." She didn't answer him with words. She simply leaned forward out of the chair and into him, scar and splint and blanket and all, and he wrapped both arms around her and held her there in the gold light of the breaking day. And for the first time, in longer than either one of them could clearly remember, neither of them was alone, in the dark. He had fallen in love with a voice. He had been broken open and remade by a face. And in the end, it was the man who had owned all the silence in the city, who finally learned how to keep a light burning through the night for someone else. And that's how a mafia boss who owned every scrap of quiet in the city got completely undone by 11 minutes of radio static at 2 o'clock in the morning. Emmerich didn't just cancel a wedding. He tore down the entire empire he'd built to keep from ever feeling anything. The moment he realized the single bravest person in his whole city was a woman the world had taught, with fire, to hide her face and give away her voice for free. Their turn from a lonely man who couldn't sleep and a voice in the dark into something unbreakable is exactly the kind of quiet, ferocious devotion we live for on this channel. If this one got to you, if you believe, like I do, that the gentlest people are almost always the strongest ones in the room, then do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to hear tonight that it is never ever too late to be different. And tell me down in the comments, what was the exact moment Emmerich fell? Was it the very first night, the voice through the static, the broken door at the top of the stairs, or the second he got down on his knees on that freezing floor? I read every one of them. I'll see you in the next story.